Our scripture this morning is found in Joshua chapter 4. Joshua chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever."
There's an old story that's told, and some of you are probably familiar with it, but there was a woman who was cooking the Easter ham, and before she put it in the pan, she cut off the end of it and put it beside the ham. And cut off the end, tucked the end beside the ham. And her husband was watching her do this, and he said, "I watch you every Easter, and you do that. You cut off the end of the ham, and you tuck it beside the ham before you cook it." And he said, "So why do you do that?" And she said, "I'm not really sure why. It's something that my mom always did." So she called her mom and she said, "Mom, you know how you cut off the end of the ham and tuck it beside it before you cook it? Just curious, why do we do that?" She said, "I'm not sure. It's something your grandma always did." Well, so she called her mom and she said, "Mom, you know how you always cut off the end of the ham when I was a kid and you tuck it in beside it before you cook it? Why did you do that?" And she said, "Because my pan was too short." See, some traditions are a little hard to understand as they get passed on to the next generation, some of the reasons for doing things in a certain way. And a lot of the times we figure that our kids or our grandkids will just watch us and they'll catch not only what we do, but they'll also catch why we do things the way we do. They'll watch how we live our lives, and they'll also catch the why we do things that way, why we live our lives in that way. But the sad truth is, without careful attention to passing along the why we do things, kids will very quickly decide not even to imitate what we do, because we'll only do things that don't really make any sense to us for so long before we'll go ahead and stop. This is the fourth message in our series, Take the Land. I look at the first 8 chapters of Joshua, looking at how the children of Israel were given an impossible mission, which was to capture and occupy a 300,000 square mile chunk of land. And in the process, seeing how God helped them to make that vision a reality. And that's a very important thing for us right now where we are in our congregation, because just like the Israelites, God has actually given us, our congregation, a mission that might seem impossible to some people. And that mission is to make disciples of all of the people in the greater Woodburn area. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens, even hundreds of them. And through the experiences of Joshua and the Israelites' conquest of the Promised Land, we can actually learn some lessons about how God can help us make His vision for us a reality. Now, in the first message, we saw that when God gave the children of Israel the mission of taking the Promised Land, He actually gave them way more than just a mission. He also gave them the power that they would need to complete the mission, and He gave them the promise of His presence all the way to the finish line. We also saw that 3 conditions that had to be met for them to be able to take advantage of that power and that presence. First of all, the people had to be strong, willing to put their backs into the jobs that He gave them to do. Second, they had to be courageous, willing to move forward immediately as soon as they knew from God what they were supposed to do. And finally, they had to be holy, completely obeying God in everything that He commanded them to do. In the second message, we saw how God encouraged the hearts of the people by showing them that He was already at work in some very concrete ways to prepare the way among the people that He was sending them to conquer. And then last week, we watched God bring a mighty miracle about the parting of the Jordan River, allowing 1.5 million Israelites to cross over into the Promised Land, and how that helped them to see clearly that God was really right in the middle of their group. Now, last week, we got the Israelites on the west bank of the Jordan, but we left the priests standing in the middle of this dried up river. This week, we're going to show how they completed the crossing and how they did three things over the next 4 days that would not only stake their claim to the land, but would ensure that the mission and vision that God gave them was passed on to the next generation. They committed themselves to passing on the faith. They ensured they were really part of the faith community, and they agreed to celebrate and share God's miraculous deliverance with the next generation. So, all of the Israelites, all 1.5 million of them, priests, soldiers, moms, teens, kids, babes in arms, have all gotten across the Jordan River, which God miraculously dried up at the moment that the priests, who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, the moment they stepped into the river dried up. The water, it actually piled up several miles to the north at a town called Adam, and it just hung there. And it refused to flow any further to the south until God's agenda was all fulfilled. So meanwhile, these 4 priests, with the Ark of the Covenant hanging from poles that are on their shoulders, and this was no light little box. The cover to the ark alone was made out of a chunk of solid gold that weighed 72 pounds. And the box itself was all gold-plated inside and out. It was a heavy box. But they're standing, and it also had stone tablets in it. And so they were standing there in the middle of the Jordan River with this box perched on these poles on their shoulders, and for hours and hours and hours while all of these Israelites crossed over the Jordan River. It takes a long time for 1.5 million people to get across a river. But before he lets them out of there, God wants the Israelites to stake their claim to the land and to pledge themselves to pass on their faith to the next generation. Now, I really love God's style. I myself have a drawer in which I keep a lot of the keepsakes from Charla's and my relationship. And there are tickets from concerts that we've attended, and tickets from places that we've gone, and name tags that we've worn at various seminars that we've gone to together. And from time to time, I kind of like just getting into that drawer and going through the stuff. And every time I do, it kind of brings back a lot of good memories. These are things that I can touch, or something that was there when we did all of these things, and it brings back to my mind all of the sights and the sounds and the tastes and the smells of that day. Well, God kind of had the same thing in mind for the Israelites. Earlier, he had told Joshua that he needed to recruit 12 volunteers, one from each of the 12 tribes, but they weren't actually told at that time what it was that they were volunteering for. But now their time had come. It says, so Joshua called together the 12 men that he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of Israel, to serve as a sign among you. See, God was actually going to make a keepsake, a memorial of the day that he dried up the Jordan so that the Israelites could cross over. A pile of 12 big stones that were taken from the riverbed. Stones that came right from where the priests were standing at that very moment. Stones as big as a man could carry on his shoulder. And this pile of stones was going to stand west of the Jordan River, right in the Promised Land, at the location of the Israelites' first campground. And being stone, that pile would last for decades or centuries, maybe even longer, maybe thousands of years. That pile of rocks could still be there. And these specially selected men did exactly that. They actually went back down into the dry riverbed, right to the place where the priests were standing firm with the ark perched on their shoulders, and they each picked up a big old rock, and they put it on their shoulders, and they carried it up to their new campsite, which, by the way, was 5 miles away from the river. It's a long ways to carry this rock, but they did. And they set them all down there, and it says Joshua piled them all up into a big stack of rocks. But that pile of rocks was way more than just a keepsake. It was way more than just a pile of rocks that said, okay, this land is now ours. See, this was a memorial that would last far into the future, and it was designed to help the Israelites to remember what their God was actually capable of, as well as an important way to pass the faith on to the next generation. Joshua writes this, in the future, when your children ask, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial for the people of Israel forever." He adds a little bit more of an explanation a little later in the chapter. He says, "For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up and before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God." You see, part of the problem with us humans is that we have very short memories. Have you ever noticed that about yourself? Yeah, some of you more than others, I've heard people tell me, "Oh man, I have a real hard time with my memory." But the thing is, we all have short memories. This memorial was going to it was going to help them to remember things. See, we do that. Our memories, they lose sharpness once an event is over in just the regular hassles of everyday life. It starts to fade down a little bit. The vividness goes away. See, that's why every Easter we tell all over again the story of the cross and the empty tomb. That's why every Christmas we tell all over again the story of the baby in the manger and the star and the shepherds. That's why we ask people to share their testimonies all about when they came to Jesus and what God has done in their lives since then. See, research has shown very clearly that we will forget even important moments in our lives unless we intentionally bring them to mind from time to time. That's why we need to continually refresh our memories. We call it that, refresh our memories, to bring it back, to relive those moments in our lives as well as those significant moments of history, to remember all over again the first time that we really understood the significance of those events in our own lives. And so God was actually making a way to help the people do exactly that. Every time the people would wander along that road and come to that pile of stones, it would instantly bring to their minds the sights and the sounds and the smells and the feeling of all those people rushing across that dry riverbed that moments before had been a rushing river moving by at flood stage. And it would start a conversation with them and whoever they happened to be with them at the time. Say, "Do you remember when?" Or, "Hey, did I ever tell you about?" Those kind of conversations that help us to refresh our memories. But in addition to remembering for our own benefit, the memorial would serve as a way to pass on the faith to the next generation. Every time a child saw that pile of stones, something that looked kind of out of place in that area, what is a pile of river rock doing 5 miles from the river? They would likely ask, "So, why is there a big pile of stones right there?" You know kids. They would ask those kind of things, wouldn't they? "Why is there that big pile of rocks right there? What's that all about?" And it would give their parents a chance to tell them the amazing story of the God that they serve. A God who is so powerful that he was able to dry up the whole Jordan River for most of the day so that the people could come across the Jordan River without even getting their feet wet. And by having them make this huge pile of river stones there on the land, God was committing his people to sharing the events of that day, to pass on their faith to the next generation, who would pass it on to the generation after that, who would also pass it on to the next generation after that, so that the people would never forget what God had done that amazing day. Now, as I mentioned last week, the day that the Israelites crossed over the Jordan was about the end of April. On the Jewish calendar, it was the 10th day of the first month. And that meant that the Passover feast was coming in 4 days, starting at sundown on the 14th day of the first month, just like God had always planned it. The problem was that the people really hadn't celebrated the Passover since the day that they left Mount Sinai. 38 years, they apparently didn't celebrate the Passover. There were a lot of things that God commanded them to do that they had just kind of let slip through the cracks as the people camped out in the wilderness for 38 years because of their disobedience. But now a new generation of people had grown up in the place of their disobedient parents, and this was the generation that was going to take the land. For most of them, It was the first time that they were ever going to celebrate the Passover in their whole lives. They might have heard about it, but this was the first time that they were actually going to celebrate it. But see, God had a big rule for eating the Passover. And that was that any male that ate it had to be circumcised. It didn't matter if they were a foreigner or a native born, an Israelite, a slave, or someone who just thought it might be kind of cool to participate in the ceremony. If they wanted to eat the Passover, they had to be circumcised. The problem was, one of those things that had fallen through the cracks during their time in the desert was that they hadn't circumcised any of the kids who had been born out there. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. I don't know why Moses let that happen. I mean, for 400 years, God was pretty clear that circumcision was the sign of the covenant between God and his people. So it seems a little weird to me that they just stopped doing it. But Joshua tells us in chapter 5, starting at verse 4, all those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the desert on their way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the desert during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about the desert for 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land that he had solemnly promised their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. So see, this isn't something we have to wonder about. It says right there, none of them were circumcised. Now, circumcision was started back in the days of Abraham, who circumcised himself and his son Ishmael and all the males in his household when he was 99 years old. And it was a rule from that point forward that every male child had to be circumcised when they were 8 days old. It was important because, as I said, it was actually the sign of the covenant that God made with his people. A mark in their flesh that showed that they were being obedient to all that God commanded them to do. In fact, the ritual was so important that God said that it had to happen on the 8th day after they were born, even if that day was a Sabbath. It wasn't one of those things that you could say, well, it's a Sabbath, we don't work on the Sabbath, so you'll have to come back tomorrow. If it was a Sabbath, you still had to do it. It was that important. So most of those who were over the age of 40 had been circumcised. But all of the boys under 40 had apparently not been. But the Passover was coming, and God wanted his people to celebrate it right here in the Promised Land. But in order to do that, the people had to make sure that they were part of the covenant community. And so the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again. But by the way, the word again doesn't mean that the men who were already circumcised had to be circumcised again. It just meant that Joshua would need to start the ritual up again, to get anybody who hadn't been circumcised kind of caught up. And then from that moment forward, to make sure that every child who was born in Israel, every male child, was circumcised on the 8th day. And Joshua said, and the people, they were instantly obedient. Chapter 5, verse 3 tells us that Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israel at Gibeath Ha'ar-Aloth. Now, one thing that most people don't think about when they read this passage is that circumcision leaves a person pretty much disabled for a while afterwards. In many nations where circumcision is practiced on adults or on teenagers, they'll tell you it usually takes about 3 weeks before the person is back to doing too much. And so doing this mass circumcision would be a real act of faith for the people. After all, think about it. The ones who were going to be out of commission were the soldiers and the warriors. During this time that they were recuperating, the whole camp would be easy pickings for anyone who decided to take them on. I mean, remember, they are now camped in enemy territory. If they all gathered together against the Israelites and said, we got to take these guys out before they take us out, they wouldn't be able to raise a sword in their own defense. I mean, remember back in Genesis 34, when the crown prince of the Shechemites had raped Jacob's daughter Dinah. Her brothers, who were justifiably upset, had persuaded the king of Shechem that the only way that Prince Shechem, yeah, they named him after the town, the only way that Prince Shechem and Dinah could be married was if the whole city, every male in the town, decided to undergo circumcision. And the people in town agreed and had every male in the whole place immediately circumcised. And then 3 days later, while the men were still in pain, is the way that the Bible puts it, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, they went in with their swords and they killed every male in the city and took their sister back. I mean, obviously, if two men could kill every man in a whole city, they weren't able to put up any kind of defense due to the pain that they were in. So circumcising most of the men in camp was actually a big risk for the Israelites, camped as they were right in the middle of the enemy territory. But God had commanded it, and God's command was an implicit promise of protection. God himself would watch over the camp while the warriors and defenders were out of commission. And so, with that reassurance, Joshua obeyed the Lord's command, and all the people were circumcised. Joshua goes on to write that after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." I've rolled away that reproach. So the place had been called Gilgal, which means rolled, been called Gilgal to that day. So the people were all ceremonially cleaned up with a sign of the covenant in place in their lives, and they were ready to celebrate the Passover. Now the Passover was celebrated first in Egypt on a dark night exactly 40 years before, when the angel of death went all throughout Egypt, killing the firstborn in every Egyptian household. And all because Pharaoh had hardened his heart and wouldn't obey God and let the people go. Because God had told them, earlier in the evening, the Israelites, they had slaughtered the lambs that they had selected 4 days earlier, and then they used leafy branches of the hyssop plant, to kind of splash the blood of the lamb on the top and sides of the doorpost. They put the blood in a bowl, they dip in the leafy branches, and then they go splash, splash, splash with the blood, and splash, splash on the sides of the doorpost. Because God had told them that they would be spared from his judgment if they would stay in the house with the blood around the door. So that night they roasted the lamb with bitter herbs. People always say they had to eat their lamb with bitter herbs. That's terrible. Well, let's think about it. It's roast lamb with onion and celery and parsley and horseradish. Sounds terrible to me, doesn't it? It's actually pretty good eating. But they roasted the lamb. They ate it standing up with their shoes on, their belts tied, their walking sticks in their hand, and all their stuff packed up and ready to go. Because God had told them that by the morning, they would not just be released by Pharaoh, but they would actually be driven out of the land. So they were ready to go. Now, when the angel of death came through the area and he saw that blood splashed around the door, he passed over that house, and he didn't kill any firstborn in it. But in every Egyptian household, from the household of Pharaoh to the household of the lowest servant, the firstborn in that household died that night. The book of Exodus tells us that there was a loud moaning and wailing and shrieking heard all throughout Egypt as the people in every house found the dead and dying, a wailing that would just make the hair on your head stand on its end. But right in the middle of the night, Pharaoh called Moses in and told him this: "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you've requested. Take the flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. And so the Israelites left the land of Egypt, and they left it for good. Obviously, the anniversary of that deliverance from the slavery was an important day for the people of Israel. It was a time that they were to celebrate each year, a time when they were to tell the story all over again and rejoice over the mighty work that God had done in setting them free. Kind of like our 4th of July, when we celebrate our independence from England and the victory that God gave us in the Revolutionary War. But for some reason, after they left Mount Sinai, they quit celebrating the Passover. Maybe it was that after the initial exultation of being free, they ended up settling into a normal day in, day out mode of existence. An existence that after they refused to enter the promised land was, for the first time, turned into just endless days camped out in the desert. Maybe they just figured that there really wasn't that much to celebrate after all, and so they stopped celebrating it. But now, as the days ticked by, while the men were all healing up from their procedure, the Passover came. And the new people of the promised land celebrated it again, many of them for the very first time. They told the story of how God had defeated Pharaoh and delivered them all from slavery. The ones who could remember it by telling the story to those who had been born later on. They roasted their lambs with bitter herbs. They ate it in family groups on their feet with their shoes on, their belts tied, and their walking sticks in their hands, remembering how when the release came, it wasn't time to get ready, it was time to go. And they generally celebrated what God had done for them in releasing them from bondage to the Egyptians, and what he was doing for them now, bringing them right into the land that had been promised them so many years ago. Which brings us to the bottom line. See, most people tend to think in the short run. Did you know that? Most people tend to think in the short run. I suppose that's normal because we tend to live in the short run. It's not like the days of Adam or Noah, where normal lifespan seems to have been 900 years or more. And see maybe your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids all the way down to 30 generations after you. Can you imagine living to see your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great- We're not even like the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where a person could expect to live for about 150 years and be able to see and play with your great-great-great-great-great-grandkids, 5 generations. Instead, our lives typically last for something less than 100 years. Few live over 100, but most of them, it's usually 100 years or less. But let me ask you a couple of questions. How many of you here are Christians? A lot of you are. How many of you who are Christians have any children who are not Christians? Almost all of you. How many of you have grandkids who aren't Christians? See, a whole lot of you. What do you think that the odds are that 6 generations from now, your great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be powerful, passionate Christians? What do you think the odds are of that? And what could you do today that might increase the odds of that happening? See, I haven't been able to find out who first said it, but some very wise person made the statement that Christianity is always one generation away from extinction. Did you get that? Christianity is always one generation away from extinction. And if you think about it, that's probably exactly true. If none of our kids accept Jesus, then the odds of their kids being Christians is really remote. At any time, the Christian faith, at least in our country, could go absolutely extinct. It's nearly gone in most of Europe. But it's not just in modern times that passing on the faith has been so vital to the growth of God's people. You see, in the little piece of history that we've looked at today, we see the beginnings of one of the greatest tragedies in the whole history that's given to us in the Bible. It's doubly tragic because all through Scriptures there are lots of places where God tells His people to be sure to teach their children about Him and about what He's done. Places like Deuteronomy 6:6-9. You have this in your sermon notes. I'd like us to read this together. Deuteronomy 6:6-9. Here we go. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. See, God is telling them to pull out all the stops to make sure that their kids are able to grab a hold of the faith for themselves. I mean, he says, it doesn't matter what you do. Talk about it all the time with your kids. If you're walking along the road, driving in your car, watching TV, turn off the TV. Tell the kids about God. Do whatever you need to do to keep it from them in their whole life. I mean, if you have to, write them on your hands. Put them on a little piece of Post-it note that you stick on your forehead so that your kids are always seeing the Scriptures. Carve them into the doorposts of your house. Put big pictures on the wall that are nothing but Scripture. Whatever you have to do, make sure that your kids get the message, that they get the Word, that they understand who God is. And he gave his people a lot of ceremonies and a lot of rituals to remind them of all the amazing things that God had done, including the Passover feast, to memorialize how God had released them from their Egyptian bondage. And in every one of those rituals, and in every one of those feasts, and in every one of those celebrations, there were written right into them specific times of teachings. Like in that video that we saw about the guys showing the kids how to make unleavened bread for Passover. The mother said, yeah, it's when we have the Seder, the Passover feast, we tell the kids all about all about Moses and the Israelites and how God released them from Egypt. It's written right into the ceremony. See, there's times when the reasons for the traditions were patiently taught to the kids, not just what the traditions were, but the reasons for them, so that the kids can grab a hold of it, so that they can learn it thoroughly and be able to pass those same traditions with those same reasons why onto their kids. See, God didn't want the Israelites to just take over the land for one generation. He intended for them to take it over and to keep it forever. And that meant that the people had to not just believe in him and to follow him and to obey his commandments, but they had to continue believing in him and obeying his commandments and following him each and every generation for all time to come. See, the real tragedy is, even though God provided the Israelites with all of these different handy ways of teaching their kids, they don't appear to have used them. I want to read you what I think is probably the saddest passage in the entire Bible. It's in Judges chapter 2, verses 7 and then 10 to 13. It says this: "The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things that the Lord had done for Israel. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths." Did you hear that? Because the people did not pass on their faith to the next generation, because they didn't make sure that their kids and their grandkids were firmly grounded in the faith, because they didn't make sure that those who came immediately after them caught fire so that they would be sure to pass that passionate faith on to the next generation, because they started focusing on the short term, within a single generation, the people totally fell away from following and serving God. And in the process, they made themselves liable to God's judgment, and God's judgment fell. They found out to their tragedy that the people of this world are not at all shy about indoctrinating our kids with their philosophy. They don't worry about forcing their beliefs on our kids. They actually look forward to it, and they plan for it. But the failure of the Israelites can actually serve as an example and an inspiration to us today. You see, God has a great plan for our congregation, a great massive vision that he's laid on the hearts of many people in our congregation, a vision of powerfully impacting our communities by making Christ-like disciples of all the people who live in them, men and women and teens and kids and prime-timers. We need to be reaching out to them all. But unless we make it our intent to start this process with the intention of having it continue in the same powerful way in the generations of believers to come, we're going to end up just being a flash in the pan, a brief glimmer of light that quickly fades into the darkness all over again. And I think it's safe to say that that is not God's plan for us.
And the